So, welcome to Indylive Extra. This is another extract from a longer program. This is taken from Indy Jigsaw show where we were focusing on Constitution for Scotland, and this is a slideshow. I did the slides, and then Fiona and I talked through them. So we thought good to have this as a standalone piece. If you're like me and you knew nothing about a claim of right, then hopefully, like me, you'll feel a little bit better informed about it at the end of this.
I certainly did.
I'm of a generation that was not taught anything about Scottish history at school. I know the phrase claim of right, but apart from that, I knew almost nothing else. So I put these slides together. It's a kind of beginner's slideshow about the claim of right, going back to 1320, the Declaration of Arbroath, but kind of context for that. There'd been the Scottish Wars of Independence. That, of course, was where William Wallace was fighting. 1314, we had Battle of Bannockburn. 1320, we get this document, perhaps drafted in Dalkeith or one of the abbeys near Dalkeith. It was written by the monks up in Arbroath, and it was Abbot Bernard, but also Robert the Bruce and the nobles of Scotland. Our most tireless prince, king and lord, the Lord Robert, to him we are bound both by his right and by his merits, that our freedom may still be maintained, and by him, come what may, we mean to stand. Yet, if he should give up what he has begun, we should exert ourselves at once to drive him out as our enemy and as a subverter of his own right and ours, and make some other man who was well able to defend us as our king. I mean, that's amazing. 1320. And I mean, Robert was one of the signatories to that, so he knew he knew what he was signing up for. No question of that. So we get to 1689, and I think this is where the phrase Scottish claim of right first appears. So the background to this one is that James VII, who was also James II of England, he'd upped and run from England over to France. So the English Parliament said, okay, he's abdicated, the throne's empty, and they offered the throne to William and Mary. Mary had a bit of a claim. They offered it to William and Mary as joint monarchs. The Scots couldn't do that because technically, he hadn't actually abdicated, he hadn't scarpered from Scotland. So they got together and he was declared unfit to rule, and then they offered the throne to William and Mary, of course. The argument was, well, he has fled to France. He had promoted the Catholic faith to the detriment of the Protestant religion of Scotland, and he had appointed judges and other officers without consulting the Scottish Parliament. So basically, he'd acted unlawfully under the laws of Scotland. And people think that the wording of it was very heavily influenced by George Buchanan, who he'd been tutor to the young Mary, Queen of Scots. So that's where it comes about. Therefore, the estates of the Kingdom of Scotland find and declare that King James VII, being a professed papist, did assume the regal power and acted as king without ever taking the oath required by law, and hath, by the advice of evil and wicked counsellors, invaded the fundamental constitution of the kingdom and altered it from a legal, limited monarchy to an arbitrary, despotic power, and hath exercised the same to the subversion of the Protestant religion and the violation of the laws and liberties of the kingdom, inverting all the ends of government, whereby he hath forfeited the right to the crown, and the throne is become vacant.
That's a fabulous description, isn't it? Just as you were reading that, and although we're talking about something from 1689, I'm thinking evil and wicked counsellors invaded the fundamental constitution of the kingdom and altered it. That's Westminster. That's a description of the current Tory party.
Yeah. And that bit about altered it from a legal, limited monarchy.
Yes, what an interesting
to in arbitrary, despotic power. I mean, that's the core of their argument. You've done this, mate. We're not having it. You're out.
A legal limited monarchy against divine right of kings. They're two completely different concepts. That is fascinating.
Then we get to 1989. There was a convention of interested parties in Scotland, and they came up with another document. It was part of the process of setting up the devolved assembly. Their declaration, it was signed by Labour Party people, the Lib Dems, civil organisations, like churches, trade unions. SNP were involved in the initial discussions, but they dropped out when it became clear that the others didn't want to have any mention of independence. So it was a group called the Scottish Constitutional Convention who came up with the actual statement.
We, gathered as the Scottish Constitutional Convention, do hereby acknowledge the sovereign right of the Scottish people to determine the form of government best suited to their needs, and do hereby declare and pledge that in all our actions and deliberations, their interests shall be paramount. We further declare and pledge that our actions and deliberations shall be directed to the following ends: to agree a scheme for an assembly or parliament for Scotland, to mobilise Scottish opinion and ensure the approval of the Scottish people for that scheme, and to assert the right of the Scottish people to secure implementation of that scheme.
They use that phrase to echo what's there in the 1689 document. It's different language, they've modernised it. So now we've got the sovereign right of the Scottish people to determine the form of government best suited to their needs.
And that phrase, we hear that a lot currently in the debate, but compared to what's gone before, and the king doesn't do what we want, we're going to get rid of him, to maybe we could get people to agree that maybe we could have a little parliament.
I suppose you have to put it in context. It was the beginning of them getting their act together, actually.
I guess they went as far as they thought they had
Yeah.
support for, and it's interesting even at this stage now to look how far beyond that we've gone, perhaps.
The next time you get reference to the claim of right was a debate at Holyrood, 2012, over 20 years from the 1989 one. And this time, it's part of the process it's going to lead to setting up the 2014 independence referendum. The debate was closed by Mike Russell. This time, the motion that they put was that the Parliament acknowledges the sovereign right of the Scottish people to determine the form of government best suited to their needs, and declares and pledges that in all its actions and deliberations, their interests shall be paramount.
We came a long way in 20 years, really, didn't it?
There was one group of people in Holyrood at the time who voted against this motion.
Would they have been of the Tory persuasion?
I think they possibly were, yes. And that's interesting, isn't it? Because not everyone else who voted for it supports independence.
Just reading that, again, it gives you a sense of how much has changed, because I don't think we would get that same response this time round. Well, we'll see what happens.
This is 2016, post-Brexit results. There was a claim of right debate that this House has considered the claim of right for Scotland. Oh, there they are. That's them doing it. It's post-Brexit. The claim of right is no longer only a historic document. It's now a fundamental principle which underlies the democracy and constitutional framework of Scotland. So that strikes me as quite an important shift. In 2014, Scotland was promised that the only way to remain in the EU was to vote to remain in the UK. In 2016, Scotland rejected Brexit. So from that follows Scotland must retain the right to revisit our independent membership of the EU. Then last one, 2018, a claim of right debate actually in the Commons itself.
The motion was that this House endorses the principles of the claim of right for Scotland, agreed by the Scottish Constitutional Convention in 1989 and by the Scottish Parliament in 2012, therefore acknowledges the sovereign right of the Scottish people to determine the form of government best suited to their needs.
You'll notice that there's not many Tory MPs there. There's a smattering of Labour people. This one was opened by Ian Blackford to reassert the right of the Scottish people to a system of government best suited to their needs. So you can see that phrase now is being repeated. What interested me was that this motion was passed unanimously, including the Tories, which I thought was interesting. It doesn't for a minute mean that the Scottish Tories are in favour of a second referendum. But it does surely show that they recognise that there's something about the claim of right. However you might think you want to use it, actually, it's part and parcel of how we think about democracy and our constitutional framework.